Good morning. Appreciate y'all being here, sticking around for Bible class this morning. Mike is back there to count our daily Bible reader counts. If you're a daily Bible reader this past week, raise your hand and he'll get you counted. And if you need a book, Barry has the books. If you need a quarterly, raise your hand and he'll get you one. Johnny, would you mind leading us in prayer before we start?
Dear Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this chance to be here today, to study your word, to worship you. We ask that everything we do be in accordance to your will. Please be with Chris and the other teachers. Help them to have a good remembrance of the things they've prepared to say. And please be with us as listeners. Help us to put into our lives things that we've learned. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. We're continuing our study of the Judges, and we're on lesson 4 in your book. Deborah and Barak is the title of our lesson. I listened to this chapter on my phone, on my Bible app, and I listened to it so I would hopefully pronounce the names correctly. The guy who was reading the chapter sounded confident in his pronunciation of the name, so I'm going to try to sound confident in my pronunciation, but I'm really not that confident. You'll probably realize that, but I'm going to try to pronounce it the way he did, so hopefully he was right. But Barak is how he pronounced the guy's name that we're studying. It might surprise you. To be honest with you, it surprised me to know that Barak is mentioned in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 being familiar to us because we call that the Faith's Hall of Fame. And you remember Moses being mentioned and Abraham being mentioned, but I'd forgotten that Barak is mentioned in that chapter. In verse 32, the Hebrews writer said, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets." So Barak is one of the judges mentioned in that chapter. I thought that was interesting. I had forgotten that. And it's specifically interesting because in our lesson this morning, Barak showed a little bit of hesitancy to do what he was asked to do, but he did ultimately go and show courage. And the other lady, or the other person who happens to be a lady that we're studying, Deborah, is unique, I think, in this story because she's a very unlikely person in this position. I mean, how many other judges do you know who happen to be female? The Bible, really, though, when you start to study, is full of people who were unlikely to be put in the position they were put. You think about David and being a shepherd, and how many people paid any attention to David when he was just a shepherd? Even his own father didn't necessarily think of him as a leader. When Samuel came to anoint a king, Jesse, who was David's father, brought the oldest son out, and then another son, and then another son, and David was sort of an afterthought, even in the eyes of his own father, but ultimately became this great king. We could look at the disciples, and nobody would have paid attention to them necessarily. Nobody would have thought of them as being the great leaders that they turned out to be. We're talking about fishermen, talking about a tax collector, other men who were described as being zealots, but you look at them and they became great leaders in the early church, and because of them, the gospel was spread throughout all the world. Deborah is another one who, to me, was an unlikely hero because she happened to be female, and that's certainly not to say that females were unimportant at this time or that they're unimportant. There was a lot of females who did great things in the Old Testament. There was a lot of women who we could look at and use as examples of being faithful to God and showing leadership in their families. But there's not a lot that I know of who were sort of political leaders, the way that Deborah is portrayed. Even Esther, Queen Esther, has a book of the Bible named after her, had the title of queen. Even she had to ask permission to go and see her husband. You know, there were certain times where she could go and see her husband, and if she went at another time and didn't have his permission, she could be killed. So even just the time that we're talking about, women in leadership was not something we normally see, but with Deborah, it is. And I think it's interesting to study some of the unlikely heroes of the Bible. Edward alluded to it this morning, some of the unsung heroes of the Bible. But God uses anybody to serve His will and do His will. He even uses wicked people to do what He wants done, as He does often with Israel. Let's read the first 3 verses of our text in Judges chapter 4, and then we're going to go backwards because there's some things we want to cover that maybe we missed last week. When Ehud was dead, this is Judges 4 verse 1, when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Horesheth and Hagoim. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now, Eric had prepared last week's lesson, but we had a guest speaker, so we didn't get to hear that lesson. So Eric, if I missed something, you feel free to jump in. But had we done last week's lesson, these first 3 verses would have sounded very similar to what happened in Judges chapter 3. Because in Judges chapter 3, starting in verse 7, it says, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. It goes on to say that He sold them into the hands of some folks in that area. They then cried out, excuse me, in verse 9 to the Lord, who raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them, Othniel. And if you look in verse 11, after this the land had rest for 40 years before Othniel dies. So the cycle continues, and we studied this time and time again. You may get tired of studying it, but Israel is faithful for a while. Times are good. They get complacent, turn to false idols. They turn away from God. God sends sometimes, in fact, I would say most times, wicked nations to overtake them and punish them. They cry out to God, please have mercy on us, forgive us, whatever they cry, and He has mercy and sends them a deliverer. Time and time again, this cycle repeats. And after that 40 years, in verse 3, we said Othniel died. And so what generally happens in Israel when a good leader dies? Followed by a bad one. The people turn away. I mean, it happens time and time again, and it's a lesson for us that we have to constantly be thinking about how we train our children and train the next generation so that when our good leaders can no longer serve, they pass on, that we have new leadership, and that we don't fall away like the children of Israel did. And so in verse 12, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so God hands them over to Moab, sends another leader. Once they cry out, He sends another leader, this Ehud. Ehud was the one in our lesson text in verse 1 that you read about. Now, Ehud kills the king of Moab. And we won't read the details of how he kills the king of Moab, but don't do it right after you eat. But sometimes read chapter 3 and just read how violent and graphic it is about how he kills the king of Moab, but God sent another deliverer once they cried out for forgiveness to kill the king of Moab and bring the children of Israel back to God. So that brings us to our text. In chapter 3, Ehud dies. And what we just said, when a good leader dies, so often in Israel, they turn away. And so the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. And this cycle of rebellion, punishment, and deliverance continues. Now, look at the time frames, because I think it's interesting to look at how long they stay close to God and stay away from God. We said after verse 9, there in verse 11 of chapter 3, the land had rest for 40 years. Before Ehud was sent, while Othniel was providing some leadership and things, they had rest for 40 years. Then they turned away, and they served the Moabites for 18 years. God then raised up Ehud, and the land had rest for 80 years. So we're not necessarily talking about short periods of time. There's several decades sometimes between these different leaders who rise up in this cycle of rebellion and punishment. But, we study that and we criticize Israel, and rightfully so, because we look at them and we say, at some point, why didn't you people get it? Why didn't you people understand that if you just stayed faithful to God, He was going to take care of you? But don't we do the same thing? The fall of 2001, late September, October, November, December 2001, what happened to church attendance in this county and across this nation? It increased. 9/11 happened, and people started going to church. People that had not been to church in years, people that had not been to church maybe ever, suddenly felt the need to draw closer to God. And our attendance went up, and attendance in church buildings across the United States went up. Where are those people this morning? We've had it pretty good. We haven't had terrorist attacks, and we have low unemployment, and we have the stock market doing pretty well. Things are good, and we had 124 this morning. We're thankful for the 124 that were here, but there are others who should be here. And so I think we can criticize Israel, but we also have to look at ourselves as people and think, are we tempted to get lazy and complacent when things are good? Because that's what happened to Israel. When things were good and they weren't under control of these wicked nations, they got lazy. And they started to serve idols, and they started to get complacent. And so it's just something for us to think about, I think. Now, I want to read a little bit out of the teacher's book, because I think it's interesting. It mentions Carthage in particular. And so I want to read this because it's not every week that we study something that has to do with Carthage. But the author of this companion book said, early in the period of Judges, when Israel had turned to other gods, God sold them into the hands of the Canaanites. While it would be a mistake to associate Canaanites with any one city, as an ethnic people, they were strongest along the seacoast of northwestern Israel. The great city of Sidon was of Canaanite origin. In time, Sidon established a trading colony called Tyre, some 25 miles to its south. Tyre, in turn, became a great city and established a colony in North Africa, southwest of the island of Sicily. Tyre called its colony the New City. The Canaanite word for new city, adapted to Latin, is Carthage, the name by which Roman historians write of it. The religion and culture of Carthage were Canaanites. So I thought that was interesting that just so happened that they talked about Carthage being part of the Canaanites, so part of a wicked nation, and Tyre and Sidon. Where have you heard Tyre and Sidon before? Or Tyre and Sidon, you might pronounce it. Yeah, he did miracles, and he pointed to those cities. He did miracles in other places that he compared to Tyre and Sidon and said, look, if the miracles I did there, if I had done those miracles in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented. And you're not. So he's used them as an example. This is two wicked places, but if they had had the opportunity to see some of the things that you've seen, they would have repented a long time ago. So these Canaanite cities that we're talking about overtaking, again, God is using cities who were not known for being good and leaders who were not known for being good to teach his people a lesson. All right, let's continue and read the rest of our text. In chapter 4, taking up in verse 4, it says, Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at this time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. And Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So Barak is showing a little bit of hesitancy. That's what I mentioned earlier, that I'll go with you, Deborah, but only if you're going to go with me. So she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. He went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent near the terebinth tree at Zanim, which is beside Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him from Horesheth Hagoim to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went up from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Now, I had plenty of mistakes in that reading, but hopefully you got the point that Deborah was a judge and prophetess who calls for Barak. Now, we don't know what all is meant by the fact that she was a judge and a prophetess, but we do know that she judged from this position between, according to verse 5, Ramah and Bethel. If you look in the maps in the back of your Bible, I don't always pay attention to those maps, but they come in pretty handy to kind of get a general idea of where these things are. The one that I have, or one of the ones I have, deals with the kingdom years. Now, this time period we're talking about is a little bit before maybe the kingdom years where this map was created, but you can still see Bethel and Ramah right above the Salt Sea. And there's a boundary, there's sort of a mountainous boundary between those two cities that separated later on Israel to the north and Judah to the south. But this is where Deborah is doing her judging. And she calls for Barak, who was in Kadesh. And if you go straight up from Ramah and Bethel, about 80 or 100 miles, you see Kadesh. So she calls for this man who is going to be a warrior to deliver Israel. In the past, God has directly sent a warrior, but now he sends Deborah to call for this Barak, 80 or 100 miles. That's a pretty good journey back then, right? I mean, we could drive 80 or 100 miles. Some of y'all maybe under 2 hours or under an hour, but hour and a half, 2 hours, I guess, to go 80 or 100 miles, unless you're going through Nashville as part of it. In this time, though, we're talking about mountains, we're talking about rough terrain, so this is a long trip to call and have Barak come and give these orders from God to go and get troops from and go to Mount Tabor. Deborah was a judge, so she would probably settle disputes and things, but as a prophetess, she spoke God's word to the people who came to her. And so she tells Barak to take his 10,000 men to Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor, we learn, is an important, not from this text, but from others, that this was an important agriculture region. It was about 6 miles from Nazareth. There are some who believe that Mount Tabor that is mentioned here is actually the mountain where Jesus was transfigured. And again, if you look on that map, it's about halfway between where Deborah was and where Barak was in Kadesh. But Deborah assures Barak, I should just call him Barak because I keep wanting to, Barak, that God would be with him, but he's not sure. Why do you think that maybe Barak was hesitant? There in verse 8, he says, if you will go with me, then I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go. Why might he have hesitated? Yeah, could have been. I don't know. I don't know the answer, but I think it's interesting to think about why he was hesitant. But to me, the fact that she was willing to go and that she came to him and relayed this message, maybe that's a lesson for us about encouragement and the power of encouragement. You never know the results that are going to happen just by encouraging somebody to do something that maybe they're hesitant to do. And probably a lot of us could tell stories of things that we did in the work of the church that we really didn't want to do, but somebody encouraged us to do it, whether it was to teach a Bible class or lead a prayer in public or deliver a lesson. You never know what that encouragement will do. And so Deborah encourages him to go, and then when he hesitates, she does go with him. Alan Webster writes the books that we use in these lessons, and he says that Barak had physical ability, Deborah had courage. So you've got this warrior in Barak who was physically able. You've got Deborah who had the courage and the foresight, but we needed them both, or Israel needed both of them, right? A lesson for us maybe on roles, the fact that each of us has a role. Their roles were very different. And the thing about Deborah is she didn't complain about her role. Her role was to encourage Barak to do what God wanted him to do. And she could have said, well, I would be better at this. I should be the one to gather these 10,000 troops and go and fight. I could do a better job. This guy's sort of cowardly, doesn't really want to do it, so why don't I just go do it? But that wasn't her role. Her role was to encourage. His role was to go and fight. 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Let's turn there. We won't read the whole chapter, but just to kind of remind us, Paul talks in this chapter about unity and diversity. He says in verse 12, "For as the body is one and has many members, but all members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slave or free, have all been made to drink into one Spirit. For in fact the body is not one member, but many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole were hearing, where would be the smelling? But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body, just as He pleased." And it goes on, and we could read the rest of the chapter, but you get the point, I think, that each of us has a role. And we have to figure out what that role is and do that role. But what I can appreciate, one of the things I can appreciate about Deborah and about this lesson is she did her role very well. And ultimately, Barak did his role. And he went and he fought, and they were victorious over these people who had him captive. So true to his word, Barak assembled his army. He said, "If you'll go with me, then I'll go." And true to his word, he assembles his army. And true to Deborah's word, God gave them victory. So the text mentions a couple of times that they had 900 chariots of iron. Not Israel, but this Jabin and his chief, Sisera. They had 900 chariots of iron. The text doesn't specifically say this, but leads us to believe that Israel didn't have 900 chariots of iron, that they were outmanned, that they were outgunned, you might say, by Jabin and his army. But that didn't matter. I mean, ultimately, the 900 chariots of iron, which would have probably been really scary at this time because it was a new technology and Israel didn't have it, that didn't matter. The size of the army didn't matter because God was on their side. And again, you would think that they would have realized this by now because they've gone back and forth, and every time God was on their side, Israel was victorious. Every time that they went away from God, they were not victorious. Comments. What jumps out to you about this lesson so far? Well, if you read the next chapter, chapter 5, and next week's lesson is going to continue. I don't want to get into next week's lesson, but in chapter 5, in verse 7, it says, "Village life ceased. It ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel." So to me, that's her legacy, the fact that she was this leader who was almost a mother figure to Israel in her leadership. But three things I want to point out as we close here about this lesson, three things that jump out to me. Number one, God uses unlikely individuals to accomplish His will. A woman being in this leadership position in the Old Testament was unlikely. And yet God used this unlikely individual to accomplish what He wanted accomplished. Number two, properly placed encouragement and motivation has a big impact. Barak would not have gone and taken these 10,000 troops to fight Jabin and his army and his 900 chariots of iron if he had not been encouraged by Deborah. And so we can maybe spend more time encouraging those around us. And number three is each of us has a role. Excuse me. Deborah's role was not the same as Barak's role. Barak's role was not the same as Deborah's role, and rather than complaining about what their role was or complaining about what their role wasn't, they did what they were supposed to do. They did what God wanted them to do, and it took both of them doing what God wanted them to do to be successful. And for us in the church, it takes all of us working together doing what God wants us to do and fulfilling our roles for the church to grow and be successful like it should be. I appreciate your attention this morning and your comments. I'm sorry that there were so many names that I sort of bumbled over this morning, but hopefully you got something out of the lesson that you can take and use. So again, thank you for being with us this morning, and hope you're able to get outside and enjoy some of that sunshine today.